19-year-old Ananya went on a dream vacation to a Caribbean resort. But on her third night, she walked out of her hotel room and was never seen again. The last person to see her, an American boy she met at the resort, and what he told police made no sense. She was supposed to be on the vacation of a lifetime. A pristine Caribbean resort, turquoise waters, luxury beyond imagination. 19-year-old Ananya Sharma had been counting down the days until this trip, a well-earned reward for her stellar grades and years of hard work. But on the third night of her dream vacation, she vanished without a trace. No goodbye, no clues. The last person to see her, a charming American boy she had just met, a boy whose story didn't quite add up. At first, Jake Reynolds told authorities that Ananya had simply walked away after a late-night conversation on the beach. But when investigators dug deeper, they realized nothing about his timeline made sense. His story changed. The security footage contradicted him. And then, just when it seemed like the case would take a dark turn, an even more chilling discovery surfaced. Someone else had been watching her that night, but by then it was too late. Ananya's disappearance sent shockwaves through the resort. Her parents woke to an empty bed, panic setting in as they searched every corner of their suite. Calls went unanswered. The concierge claimed she hadn't checked out. The beach where she had last been seen held no signs of struggle, just the eerie silence of the waves lapping against the shore. Jake was the last known person to be with her, but when questioned, his words stumbled. First, he said they had talked near the water and then she left. Later, he admitted they had argued about something small, but he refused to say what. And then, in a whisper, almost as if he was afraid of his own words, he muttered, "I don't remember." But the cameras remembered. Hotel security footage showed Ananya leaving the pool area at 1:12 a.m. At 1:23 a.m., a different camera caught a shadowy figure, her unmistakably walking toward the resort's private dock. Alone, she never returned. The staff searched the grounds, the marina, the beach, every possible place a teenager might wander off to. But Ananya wasn't the kind of girl who just disappeared. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She was careful. So where did she go? And why did Jake, who swore he had gone straight to bed, have a GPS location on his phone that placed him near a hidden cove at almost the same time Ananya was last seen? The police took him in for questioning. They checked his texts, his calls, his search history. Nothing outright incriminating, just a string of unanswered messages to Ananya, one of them reading, "You need to trust me. Don't do anything stupid." What was she planning? What had she told him? And why was a local fisherman suddenly coming forward with an unsettling revelation, one that changed everything the police thought they knew? Because that fisherman saw a boat leave the dock that night, a boat with two people, one of them a girl in a blue dress. Ananya had been wearing a blue dress, but the other figure on that boat, the one at the wheel, it was Jake, which meant someone else knew exactly what happened that night, and they weren't talking. The police immediately widened their search, now working with two terrifying possibilities. Either Ananya had willingly gotten on that boat or she had been forced. Her parents refused to believe she would leave on her own. She was careful, cautious, the kind of girl who always texted back, always let someone know where she was going. And yet there she was, caught on a grainy camera, stepping onto a boat in the middle of the night with an unknown figure. Jake was still their primary suspect. The inconsistencies in his statements, his reluctance to fully cooperate, it was all too suspicious. But there was a problem. His passport, credit card, and room key all indicated that he hadn't left the resort since checking in. And his phone, the one that had pinged near the cove. A deeper forensic search revealed something chilling. His GPS location had been manually entered at that spot. It wasn't an automatic tracking ping. Someone had wanted it to look like he was there. Meant that someone was framing him. But why? And then, as investigators combed through hours of security footage, something clicked. Jake and Ananya weren't alone on that beach that night. A shadow, just barely visible behind the palm trees, someone standing still watching them. And then another detail, a blurry reflection in the glass door near the bar. A man, early 40s, tall, muscular, wearing staff uniform. A man who shouldn't have been there at that hour. They pulled up his employment records. Lucas Ortega, resort employee, worked on maintenance mostly with the boats. No prior offenses, no red flags, but one thing stood out. He had been assigned to a repair job that night right next to the dock. He had been there, he had seen her, but was he just a witness, or was he something worse? Police rushed to find him, but Ortega was already gone. His shift had ended at 6 a.m. He had collected his paycheck. Then, according to staff, he had left in a hurry. No one had seen him since. And that's when they discovered the final, most terrifying clue, a small boat missing from the marina, and Ananya's phone found smashed under the dock like someone had deliberately destroyed it. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was an abduction, and now the clock was ticking. Ananya had been missing for over 24 hours, and the reality was setting in. If they didn't find her soon, they might never find her at all. The Caribbean sun was rising over the resort, casting an almost mocking glow on the sand, as if the world had simply moved on while her parents spiraled into desperation. Her mother, Priya, refused to leave the hotel lobby, demanding updates from the local police every hour. Her father, Vikram, had stopped speaking altogether. He stood at the dock, staring at the water, waiting for his daughter to walk back onto shore. But she wouldn't. Jake was still in police custody, but the focus had shifted. He wasn't their prime suspect anymore. Lucas Ortega was the problem. The police had no idea where he was, and then another break in the case. Ananya's best friend from India, Meera, sent a frantic voicemail to her mother. "Auntie, I don't know if this means anything, but Ananya texted me last night. She said she had a really bad feeling about something. She said someone at the resort was watching her. But she thought she was just being paranoid. I told her to be careful, but I never heard back. I'm scared. What if—" Her voice cut off, but there it was, the missing piece. Ananya knew she was in danger before she disappeared, and the real nightmare. Lucas Ortega wasn't just any resort employee. He had a record, not in the Caribbean, not in the U.S., but in Venezuela. Arrests for violence, suspicion of human trafficking, and then he vanished off the grid. Until now. The police knew they were no longer just looking for a missing girl. They were hunting a predator, and he had a 24-hour head start. She was supposed to be on the vacation of a lifetime. A pristine Caribbean resort, turquoise waters, luxury beyond imagination. 19-year-old Ananya Sharma had been counting down the days until this trip, a well-earned reward for her stellar grades and years of hard work. But on the third night of her dream vacation, she vanished without a trace. No goodbye. No clues. The last person to see her was a charming American boy she had just met, a boy whose story didn't quite add up. At first, Jake Reynolds told authorities that Ananya had simply walked away after a late-night conversation on the beach. But when investigators dug deeper, They realized nothing about his timeline made sense. His story changed. Security footage contradicted him. And then, just when it seemed like the case would take a dark turn, an even more chilling discovery surfaced. Someone else had been watching her that night, but by then it was too late. Ananya's disappearance sent shockwaves through the resort. Her parents woke to an empty bed, panic setting in as they searched every corner of their suite. Calls went unanswered. The concierge claimed she hadn't checked out. The beach where she had last been seen held no signs of struggle, just the eerie silence of the waves lapping against the shore. Jake was the last known person to be with her, but when questioned, his words stumbled. First, he said they had talked near the water and then she left. Later, he admitted they had argued about something small, but he refused to say what. And then, in a whisper, almost as if he was afraid of his own words, he muttered that he didn't remember. But the cameras remembered. Hotel security footage showed Ananya leaving the pool area at 1:12 a.m. At 1:23 a.m., a different camera caught a shadowy figure, her unmistakably walking toward the resort's private dock. Alone, she never returned. Staff searched the grounds, the marina, the beach, every possible place a teenager might wander off to. But Ananya wasn't the kind of girl who just disappeared. She was careful, organized, the type who always let someone know her whereabouts. So where did she go? And why did Jake, who swore he had gone straight to bed, have a GPS location on his phone that placed him near a hidden cove at almost the same time Ananya was last seen? The police took him in for questioning. They checked his texts, his calls, his search history. Nothing outright incriminating, just a string of unanswered messages to Ananya, one reading, "You need to trust me. Don't do anything stupid." What was she planning? What had she told him? And why was a local fisherman suddenly coming forward with an unsettling revelation, one that changed everything the police thought they knew? That fisherman claimed he had seen a boat leave the dock that night, a boat with two people. One of them, a girl in a blue dress. Ananya had been wearing a blue dress. But the other figure on that boat, the one at the wheel, was not Jake, which meant someone else knew exactly what happened that night, and they weren't talking. The police widened their search, now considering two possibilities. Either Ananya had willingly gotten on that boat or she had been forced. Her parents refused to believe she would just run away. She was level-headed, responsible, never one to slip off silently. The new evidence was almost too much to handle, captured by a grainy camera, stepping onto a boat in the middle of the night with an unknown figure. Jake remained the primary suspect, but his passport, credit card, and room key all indicated he had not left the resort since checking in. And his phone, the one that had pinged near the cove, turned out to have been tampered with. Someone had manually entered a false location which pointed to a frame job. But why would anyone want to frame him? As investigators pored over security footage, they made a discovery. Jake and Ananya weren't alone on the beach that night. Behind the palm trees, just barely visible, stood a shadow. Another camera revealed the reflection of a tall man in staff uniform lingering behind the bar's glass door. They matched him to a maintenance worker named Lucas Ortega. Officially, he was on shift repairing equipment near the dock. No criminal record within the local system. Yet, upon closer inspection, they found references to his name in Venezuelan databases, along with mentions of suspected human trafficking. By the time the authorities tried to reach him, Ortega was gone. He had left at dawn after collecting his paycheck, and a small boat was missing from the marina. Under that very dock, Ananya's phone was found deliberately smashed. This wasn't a disappearance anymore. It was an abduction. The sun rose on what should have been another beautiful day in paradise, but the resort was plunged into collective worry. Investigators consoled Ananya's parents. They had a lead now, someone to focus on. But Ortega was nowhere to be found, and each passing hour felt like the window to save Ananya was sliding closed. Her mother, Priya Sharma, became a permanent fixture in the lobby, refusing to leave until the police brought updates. Her father, Vikram, stood stoically by the water most of the day, silent and hollow. Jake, meanwhile, remained in custody for further questioning. His story had inconsistencies, but as new clues surfaced, it looked more like he was a pawn in a bigger game. Priya's phone buzzed suddenly. It was a voice message from Ananya's best friend, Meera, back in India. The message, left late the previous night, was frantic. Ananya had texted Meera saying she felt someone was watching her, that she was worried but tried to shrug it off. Meera had told her to stay cautious, then never heard back. Now, hearing the news of Ananya's disappearance, Meera was panicking, begging Priya for any information. This piece of the puzzle indicated that Ananya had sensed she was in danger before it actually happened. Local authorities sprang into action. They checked staff logs, dredged up Ortega's references, discovered old rumors of violence and associations with criminal elements. If he had truly taken Ananya, they were dealing with a seasoned predator, someone who might vanish at sea or slip into lawless port towns. Helicopters were deployed to scan the nearby islands. The Coast Guard set up checkpoints. Every clue was precious, every lead a lifeline. Yet so many questions remained. Why would Ortega target Ananya? Was this a kidnapping for ransom or something more sinister? As the resort's main courtyard turned into a makeshift command center, uniformed officers paced to and fro, guests peered anxiously from behind columns, and the managers tried to maintain order. Tourists who had once roamed carefree were now guarded and fearful. Some left early, unnerved by the abduction. Others stayed to help. Flyers bearing Ananya's photograph were taped to the walls, her bright smile a painful reminder of who she was before this nightmare. Priya and Vikram held on to hope, but dread was eroding their composure. They huddled with detectives, pleading for any glimmer of progress. Rumors spread. A staff member had overheard Ortega on a phone call in the break room, speaking in rapid Spanish about a vessel needing repairs. Others claimed he had been spotted conversing with two men near a run-down fishing trawler. The stories were unconfirmed. All they had was a name and a missing girl. Jake, from the cramped interrogation room, insisted on his innocence. He recalled his last moments with Ananya. They were sitting on the sand, the moon high above, waves lapping at their feet. He noticed her face was tight, that she kept glancing over her shoulder. He asked if she felt unsafe. She deflected, saying it was just a weird feeling. Then they walked back toward the resort. Partway there, Ananya insisted she needed some time alone to think. He tried to convince her to return to her room, but she refused, and that led to a brief argument. Finally, she left him by the pool area. After that, he wandered for a while, lost in thought, upset that she wouldn't open up. He had no idea someone else was watching her. Detectives pressed him about the text telling her, "You need to trust me. Don't do anything stupid." What did that mean? Jake struggled to explain. Ananya had confided in him in vague terms about seeing someone lurking around. She was thinking of confronting that person on her own to clarify what they wanted. Jake pleaded with her not to, insisting she talk to someone in authority. He was worried she was being reckless. But when she walked away that night, he assumed she was just heading to her room. No part of him imagined she would end up on a boat at 1:30 in the morning. Yet the digital breadcrumb that placed him at the cove had no explanation other than foul play on someone else's part. Meanwhile, at a nearby marina, police established a search perimeter. The row of small fishing boats bobbed in the early morning sun, lines creaking, gulls calling overhead. Officer Daniela Ramos scanned the horizon through binoculars, searching for anything suspicious. The local fisherman who had seen a mysterious boat leave in the night came forward again. He mentioned the vessel had no identifying marks, that the engine was unusually quiet. Smugglers, he warned. Human traffickers, drug runners. They customized boats to evade notice. Ramos and her team inspected the docks, questioned boat owners, but found no immediate clues. Ortega could have easily acquired a vessel on short notice, especially if he had local criminal connections. At the police station, Priya and Vikram slumped in plastic chairs across from Senior Inspector Miguel Torres, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. In carefully chosen words, Torres explained that Interpol had been notified neighboring countries. Law enforcement agencies were on alert, and the Coast Guard had expanded their patrol. But the region was immense, dotted with countless islets, coves, and hidden lagoons. If Ortega was halfway competent, he could hide for a while. Hearing this, Priya felt tears burning at the back of her eyes. She pressed her lips together, refusing to let anguish consume her. She had to remain strong for Ananya. She repeated that in her mind like a mantra. Somewhere out there, in a secluded inlet behind jagged rocks, a small boat lay at anchor. Its once-white hull bore scrapes and patches of mismatched paint. Dark water lapped at the sides. Inside the cramped cabin, Ananya was tied to a chair, her wrists raw from the ropes. She was alive but battered by thirst, fear, and exhaustion. When she first regained consciousness, she had been disoriented. A dull ache throbbed in her skull from whatever chemical Ortega used to subdue her. But her mind was sharp enough to register the horrifying truth. She'd been taken. She remembered following him down to the dock, trusting him for just a moment because he was a staff member. One misstep, and now she was a prisoner. The first time he came into the cabin, he pressed a bottle of water to her lips. She gulped it down, too desperate to refuse. She begged for an explanation. He said very little, only that it was simple. She threatened him, saying the police would come, her parents would never stop looking. He shrugged it off, telling her they would be leaving soon. Later, as she listened through the thin walls of the cabin, she picked up snippets of conversation in Spanish. She couldn't understand it all, but certain words and phrases stood out. Money, transportation, meeting point. Each fragment felt like a puzzle piece in a terrifying plot. She surmised Ortega was in contact with someone else, maybe multiple people. Whether they were partners or buyers, she didn't know. She prayed help would arrive before she was moved again. Time dragged painfully. She had no sense of the hour, no idea whether it was morning or night. All she could do was test her bindings, trying to find slack in the rope. So far, there was none. Her wrists were rubbed nearly raw. Her ankles felt numb from lack of circulation. Yet she refused to give in to despair. She reminded herself she had gotten top marks in her classes because she never gave up, never accepted failure. Now more than ever she needed that fierce determination. The moment an opportunity presented itself, even the faintest chance, she would act. Until then, she had to stay alive, stay alert, and not let fear cloud her mind. Back at the resort, news of her disappearance continued spreading. Some guests demanded refunds, outraged that they hadn't been informed earlier about a potential threat on the property. Others organized candlelight vigils on the beach at night, holding small electric lanterns and praying for her safe return. A tension radiated through the place, an unsettling reminder that paradise could harbor monsters. In the staff quarters, hushed whispers circulated about Ortega. Some said they'd always found him polite but distant. Others claimed he once bragged about making big money after hours. None could have foreseen him kidnapping a guest. Priya and Vikram spent hours combing the resort themselves, visiting the spots Ananya liked. The juice bar where she chatted with friends. The path under the palm trees where she took pictures of birds. The small souvenir shop where she once bought a seashell necklace. Each place was haunted by her absence. Priya sometimes felt paralyzed, as though she were stuck in a nightmare. Vikram's grief manifested in near silence, a stoic front that crumbled only when he was alone with Priya. He lashed out at the resort manager, accusing them of neglecting security. He pressed the police to do more. At some point, they realized they had hardly eaten or slept, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was finding Ananya. Jake, after another round of questioning, was told he was free to move about the resort, but instructed not to leave town. The police still considered him a person of interest, but their focus was on Ortega. Jake, plagued by guilt, walked the shore alone. Tourists cast suspicious glances his way, having heard rumors that he was somehow involved. He thought about the moments he'd shared with Ananya, talking about college, travel ambitions, dreams for the future. They had bonded quickly, forging a connection that was deeper than the usual holiday flirtation. Now she was missing, and he felt helpless. Determined to do something, he tried to help the search. He showed investigators every conversation they'd had, every text, every detail of their time together, hoping to uncover a clue. In a fortunate turn, a woman in the housekeeping staff revealed something she'd witnessed 2 days before. She had seen Ortega and Ananya in the hallway by the gift shop. She recalled that Ananya asked him a question, something about directions, while holding a brochure. Ortega seemed caught off guard, almost nervous. This fleeting interaction had appeared innocent at the time, but perhaps he'd taken an interest in her then. Maybe that was when the plan took root, or maybe he targeted her even before. No one could say. In the makeshift command center, Detective Javier Cruz scanned a map of the coastline. Red circles marked potential hideouts, places a small boat could pull in under cover of darkness. One area stood out, a reef station about 4 miles offshore, near a cluster of jagged rocks that jutted like broken teeth from the sea. The water there was treacherous, but smugglers sometimes used it as a transfer point. A local volunteer mentioned Ortega had done boat maintenance in that area a week prior. Could he be there now? Cruz organized a search party. A police speedboat and 2 smaller vessels set out before dawn, scanning the reefs and inlets with flashlights. Priya and Vikram wanted to join, but the officers insisted they remain on shore. Everyone waited anxiously for news. Hours passed with no sign of Ortega's boat or Ananya. The ocean was vast, and he could have easily moved on. Yet each unsuccessful sweep forced them to expand their search radius. A lead came in from a fisherman on a neighboring island who reported seeing a man matching Ortega's description the previous night, buying supplies at a small market. The man paid in cash, loaded crates of food and water into a boat, then headed east. That sighting gave the police a direction to focus on: the open sea beyond a chain of lesser-known keys. The race was on. They had to overtake him before he slipped into international waters or found a lawless port to vanish into. Meanwhile, Ananya tried to conserve her energy. She drifted between fitful dozing and sharpened awareness, snapping fully awake at every sound outside the cabin. After an indeterminate stretch of time, maybe half a day, maybe more, Ortega returned. He placed a small packet of crackers in her lap and removed the gag from her mouth. She devoured the crackers, ignoring how dry they made her throat. He offered a sip of water. She stared at him, mustering every ounce of defiance she could. He responded by avoiding her eyes. She asked if he had family, if he had children, trying to humanize herself, hopping to spark a flicker of empathy. He snorted, saying he had no children and that he didn't want to chat. She pressed, "Why are you doing this? Is this about money? Is there someone else controlling him?" He stayed silent. Finally, he muttered that she would be fine if everything went according to plan. Her heart lurched at the implication that something could go wrong and that her welfare was tied to events she didn't understand. She demanded he let her speak to her parents, to at least tell them she was alive. He gave no answer, simply re-gagged her and stepped out. She heard the clanging of metal on deck as he hauled the anchor, the engine sputtering to life. The boat began to move again, rocking her in the chair, forcing her to brace herself to avoid tipping over. She felt panic rising. Each rotation of the propeller carried her farther from rescue. She didn't know if it was day or night, only that the engine droned on for what felt like hours. Eventually, the boat slowed, the engine idled, then cut off with a final shudder. She tried to keep track of direction, north, south, east, west, but tied up and blind to the outside, she could hardly guess. She heard muffled voices. At least one other person besides Ortega was out there. A second boat. Fear churned in her stomach. This could mean a transfer or something worse. At the resort, the hours dragged by. Priya sat by the phone, refusing even to move for a meal. Vikram stood guard at the dock, scanning every incoming boat, his hope draining as the sun sank lower. A few staff members brought them bottled water, some fruit, but neither had much appetite. They couldn't fathom returning to their normal life without their daughter. Through tears, they blamed themselves. Should they have come on this trip? Should they have watched her more closely? Late in the afternoon, an officer rushed into the lobby with a critical piece of information. They had located an abandoned boat in a hidden cove. It matched the description of the missing marina vessel Ortega had taken. Inside, they found traces of duct tape, an empty water bottle, and a single blue thread stuck to the seat cushion. It appeared someone had been held there, but Ortega and Ananya were gone. Footprints led away from the cove, up into a small network of rocky trails that wove between dense brush. The search team lost the trail near a gravel road. A local farmer claimed to have seen a man fitting Ortega's description driving off in a battered truck with foreign plates. But there were no further details, no sign of Ananya. It seemed Ortega had arranged for ground transportation, possibly an accomplice to drive him to a second location. As night fell, Law enforcement expanded their perimeter inland. They alerted the local authorities in every coastal town and rural checkpoint. Interpol bulletins flashed across borders. The manhunt was underway, but the question was whether it would be in time. Jake hovered on the sidelines, desperate to help, but he was under strict instructions to stay put. He lurked near the search command area, feeling like an intruder in the Sharma's pain. He saw Priya by the water, hugging herself as the ocean breeze whipped her hair. Slowly, he approached, guilt weighing on him. She looked over at him, eyes rimmed with fatigue. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she asked in a trembling voice what her daughter had been like in the last hours before she vanished. Jake told her about Ananya's excitement for upcoming snorkeling trips, how her face lit up talking about seeing sea turtles. He recounted how she teased him about not knowing how to properly crack a coconut, how they joked about him being a clueless tourist. Priya smiled for a second, tears welling up, thanking him for those memories. She needed to know Ananya had been happy, that there was joy in her last free moments. After a moment, Priya asked if he truly believed Ortega was behind all of this. Jake hesitated but said yes, he did. He had no other explanation. All he wanted was for Ananya to be found safe. In the rented truck rumbling down a bumpy road miles away, Ortega gripped the steering wheel. Another man sat in the passenger seat, eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the dimming light. In the back seat, Ananya was curled on the floor, wrists and ankles bound, her mouth taped shut. She felt every jolt in the road, every pothole. She tried not to whimper in pain. The driver turned to Ortega, speaking in Spanish, something about meeting a contact at a roadside bar. Ortega replied with a nod. Ananya's heart raced. She realized this was more than a lone abductor. This was a network, a chain of events she had become entangled in without warning. She wanted to scream, but the tape muffled everything. They drove for what felt like an eternity, eventually pulling off onto a dirt track. The headlights illuminated a rundown establishment with flickering neon lights that spelled out a name in Spanish. Reggaeton music thumped from inside. Ortega and his partner got out. One of them kept a gun trained on Ananya. The other reached in, hoisting her upright. She tried to struggle, but exhaustion weakened her. They hustled her around the back of the building, out of sight. She heard laughter, saw silhouettes of patrons inside through grimy windows, completely unaware that a kidnapped girl was being dragged by just a few paces away. They led her into a dimly lit storeroom, the stench of stale beer and mold thick in the air. They propped her against the wall while Ortega barked instructions. His accomplice peered down at her with unsettling curiosity as though assessing her value. She trembled, fear pushing tears from her eyes. Ortega's phone rang. He stepped aside to answer, leaving her under his partner's watchful gaze. The partner said something in Spanish about money, gesturing to Ananya. She didn't understand the exact words, but she caught the gist. She was a commodity to them. A tear slid down her cheek, but she remained determined to survive. She tried to keep track of every door, every possible exit. The storeroom had no windows, only a single door leading to the alley and another door into the main bar area. Maybe she could dart for the bar if she freed her hands. But she knew that if she rushed out, her captors could easily catch her. She thought about screaming, but the blasting music outside might drown out her cries for help. Still, she kept planning. If she found even the slightest chance, she would take it. The storeroom was filthy. its concrete floor stained by years of spilled beer and neglect. Boxes of liquor were stacked haphazardly along one wall, and the air smelled of mildew. She tried to shift her body into a more comfortable position, but the rope around her ankles bit into her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, surging with each muffled burst of reggaeton pulsing from the bar beyond. Over the thud of the music, she heard Ortega's low voice in the alley, the rapid cadence of a tense phone conversation. His partner loomed in the doorway, arms folded, lips set in a grim line. She realized that if she wanted to survive, she needed to observe every detail, every routine, every vulnerability. Her captor glanced over, meeting her eyes for a moment with an unsettling lack of emotion. She tried to look away, not wanting to incite any further aggression. Then the door banged open, revealing Ortega. He stepped inside, his jaw tight, sweat dotting his forehead. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. Without speaking, he grabbed a plastic water jug from one of the shelves, unscrewed the lid and lifted it to Ananya's lips. She sipped cautiously, not sure if there was anything else mixed in, but it tasted like regular water. She had no choice but to trust it. The dryness in her throat made swallowing painful, yet she forced herself to drink. Anything that kept her alive was worth grasping. Ortega replaced the jug and pulled out his phone, scrolling for a moment before addressing his companion in a rough voice. They began conversing in Spanish, fast and clipped. She picked up the words for midnight, road, and money. Something was happening soon, some kind of exchange or meeting or departure. She felt a sick sense of dread at the idea that she might be traded or transferred to someone else. She wanted to scream for help, to pound on the wall and hope a passerby might notice. But the music was deafening and the back of the bar was isolated from the street. Even if she did manage to make a noise, how quickly could she be silenced? Outside, a car engine revved, doors slammed, raised voices drifted through the walls, angry men shouting about a late payment. She had no idea what it was about. The tension only added to the dread swirling in her stomach. She looked at the door leading to the main bar area, searching for any sign that an employee or local might wander in. She had no clue if that would help her or if everyone there was involved in something illegal. Her head spun with questions. Why had Ortega chosen her specifically? Was she just a random target, or had he stalked her from the moment she arrived at the resort? Was this about ransom, or did it have something to do with a human trafficking ring? She recalled hearing stories about kidnappings, forced labor, terrifying black market trades. The possibilities were nauseating. She clenched her jaw, trying not to spiral into panic, reminding herself that she had to stay calm and look for an opportunity. Meanwhile, the resort was awash in rumors and speculation. Guests whispered wild theories, from organ harvesting to sinister cults. The staff tried to reassure them that the police were on the case, but panic permeated the atmosphere. Priya was so distraught she found it hard to form coherent sentences. Vikram kept pressing for new information, refusing to yield any ground in his demands for immediate action. He wanted roadblocks, wanted the entire island locked down. But the regional police had jurisdictional limits, plus a labyrinth of back roads to monitor. More than once, Vikram demanded that he be taken along on searches, that he could personally fund a more thorough investigation. Detective crews tried to appease him by assigning additional officers, but the manhunt felt overwhelmingly large. Their best lead, that Ortega's abandoned boat was found in the cove, had reached a dead end. Beyond the footprints and a vague report of a battered truck, they had nothing. No license plate, no sightings on security cameras. Whoever was helping Ortega knew how to avoid detection. Jake paced near the shoreline, guilt tearing at him. He pictured Ananya's face, that half-worried, half-hopeful expression when she'd confessed to him that someone seemed to be watching her around the resort. He had urged her not to do anything rash. Still, he felt he hadn't done nearly enough. Over and over he replayed their final interaction, her telling him she needed space, him pressing her with questions. Maybe if he had just let it go, if he had offered to walk her to her room again, things would have been different. He made a vow to himself that if he ever got the slightest chance to help rescue her, he would act, no matter the risk. One of the resort employees, an older security guard with a kind face, approached and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. In halting English, he told Jake not to blame himself, that bad people sometimes do bad things for reasons beyond anyone's control. Jake appreciated the sentiment but couldn't fully embrace it. He nodded anyway, forcing a grim half-smile. Then, remembering some suspicious detail about the beach that night, he asked if the guard had been on duty. The man shook his head, saying he started his shift around 5 a.m., well after Ananya's disappearance. He had no additional insight. Jake sighed and kept packing. Priya and Vikram maintained their vigil in the makeshift command center, a small office near the concierge desk that had been commandeered by the police. Maps covered the walls, dotted with colored pins. Every potential route Ortega might take, every rumored hideout or safe house was marked. Officers manned phones, receiving tips and checking leads, most of which led nowhere. Someone claimed they saw a man who resembled Ortega at a roadside fruit stand. Another insisted they heard gunshots near a swampy area. Police squads followed these tips but returned empty-handed. Each false lead felt like one more rung in a ladder of despair. When the sun set again, Priya realized with horror that it had now been well over a day since Ananya vanished. She refused to sleep. She paced the length of the office, feeling trapped in a nightmare. At the dingy roadside bar, Ortega and his partner had been joined by two other men. Through the thin wall separating Ananya from the main area, she heard the muffled clink of bottles and a low muttering as they conducted whatever business had brought them here. She tested her wrist bindings again, gritting her teeth at the pain. Her eyes flicked around the storeroom, searching for something sharp. She spotted a rusty nail poking out of a wooden crate in the corner, half bent but potentially sharp enough to fray rope if she could reach it. The problem was, she couldn't simply shuffle over without being noticed. She had to wait, keep a low profile, hope that her captor's guard might slip for even a moment. Ortega's partner stomped out for a smoke. The door leading to the alley slammed shut behind him. Now only Ortega remained in the storeroom with her, and he was packing as he spoke on the phone again. She couldn't make out much of his one-sided conversation other than the words "tonight" and "double." It sounded like he was negotiating a price. Then, abruptly, he ended the call and stared at her. She froze, her pulse pounding so loudly she thought he might hear it. She saw his expression waver. Uncertainty clouded his eyes as though for a split second he was reconsidering everything. He looked almost regretful, as if he realized the gravity of what he was doing. But the moment passed quickly. He averted his gaze. She tried one last time to reason with him. With the gag no longer in place, She mustered all the calm she could. "You don't have to do this. Whatever they're paying you, my parents can pay more." He hesitated, lips twisting as though he were chewing on the thought. "You don't understand," he muttered, and the darkness in his tone told her that he might not have much choice in the matter. Maybe he was threatened by someone higher up. Maybe he owed money or was in too deep with a cartel. If that was the case, there was no telling how far he'd go to protect himself. He shot a glance at the storeroom door, then back at her. "If everything goes well, you'll be on your way soon." She swallowed her fear, uncertain if that implied release or a different fate. He stepped toward her, slid his phone into his pocket and produced a fresh strip of duct tape. Without warning, he placed it firmly over her mouth. She winced but resisted the urge to lash out, suspecting any struggle would only provoke him. Then he grabbed a dirty rag and tied it over her eyes, plunging her world into darkness. She heard him speak softly, a low reassurance that she shouldn't panic, but she couldn't have complied even if she'd wanted to. Tension coiled in her chest as she felt the fabric of the rag pressing on her eyelids. Footsteps approached. She felt hands on her shoulders, yanking her to her feet. Her ankles were still tied, so when Ortega tried to move her forward, she nearly fell. He adjusted his hold, half carrying her. She sensed the shift from the cool storeroom air to the warm, humid alley. Someone was cursing under their breath, guiding her into what felt like the back seat of a car. The vinyl seat smelled of stale cigarettes. The door slammed, and moments later the engine rumbled. She was on the move again. Back on the main road, palm trees swayed in the humid night breeze, their silhouettes backlit by street lamps. The small local towns blinked past in fleeting flashes of light and color. Drivers carried on their routines, shuttling tourists, moving produce, living daily lives, unaware that somewhere in the flow of traffic, a captive girl sat bound in the back seat of a vehicle, heading toward an unknown destination. Had the police known of this route, they might have set up barricades, but the labyrinth of roads made it impossible to cover them all without more manpower. Several miles away, a local volunteer assigned to roadside checks clutched a flashlight and waved down cars, comparing drivers to Ortega's description. Most vehicles carried families, couples, or solo truckers delivering goods. None matched the profile. The volunteer had no idea the target had chosen another route entirely. A sense of futility weighed on the search teams as the hours dragged into late evening. Each time a checkpoint waved a car on, they wondered if they had just let the kidnappers slip through. Priya sat in the resort's quiet courtyard, the night air heavy with the scent of frangipani. She felt an ache in her chest that refused to subside. She tried to recall the last words she had spoken to Ananya. They had been about the coral reef tour, about wearing enough sunscreen, about keeping her phone charged. Ordinary worries that felt trivial now. Vikram gently placed a hand on her shoulder. He was as broken as she was, struggling to maintain composure. A detective approached, telling them that there were no new leads but that they shouldn't lose hope. Priya forced a nod, though hope felt distant. Jake lingered nearby, torn between wanting to comfort them and feeling unworthy of doing so. Their daughter had been in his company shortly before vanishing. He couldn't erase that reality. He quietly asked the detective if there was any possibility that Ananya might have escaped on her own. The detective shook his head, saying all the evidence pointed to a forced abduction. Jake stared at the moonlight glinting on the waves, hiding the helplessness that settled over him like a shroud. Somewhere in the weaving roads inland, the car carrying Ananya bumped and jostled over potholes and dirt tracks. She couldn't see anything, couldn't speak, hands tied in her lap. She listened to the men talk in subdued tones. They seemed on edge. The partner asked if the police had any idea where they were heading. Ortega replied that they should avoid main highways for a while. She heard the distant blast of a motorcycle engine, the occasional honk of a truck passing. The rag over her eyes felt hot and suffocating. Whenever the car slowed, she tensed, thinking perhaps they'd reached their destination. Then the journey would continue. The sense of dread never left her. She thought about her parents, praying that they were safe, that they had the resources to track her down. Eventually, the car ground to a stop, gravel crunching under the tires. Car doors opened. She was tugged out, stumbling onto solid ground. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting vegetation. She guessed they were near some sort of swamp or dense forest. Crickets chirped and frogs croaked in the darkness. The men guided her forward, forcing her to hop awkwardly. After a moment, Ortega muttered something, and she felt him kneel to slice the rope binding her ankles. She almost cried out in relief at the rush of blood to her feet, but she was in no position to run. They still gripped her arms, and she was blindfolded. She took shaky steps, hearing the squelch of mud underfoot. They led her up wooden steps that groaned under their weight. A door creaked open, and they steered her inside, the air changing from humid night to musty confinement. The smell reminded her of mold and old wood, tinged with something chemical, like paint thinner or gasoline. A switch flicked, light buzzed overhead. Someone removed the rag from her eyes, leaving the duct tape across her mouth but letting her see the space. They stood in a one-room shack with boarded-up windows. A single flickering light bulb swung from the ceiling. The walls were lined with tattered insulation and exposed beams. She noticed canisters stacked against one wall, perhaps old fuel containers or supplies. A rickety table with a single metal chair sat in the center. Ortega jerked his head, signaling her to sit. She sank onto the chair, her legs quivering. The men hovered, and she tried to glean any detail that might hint at her location. Through a gap in the boards, she saw darkness outside, maybe trees. She had no idea if they were near a main road or deep in the wilderness. The men began unloading bags from the vehicle, rummaging for something. Her mind whirled with possibilities. Maybe they planned to hide out here for a night, or maybe they intended to keep her prisoner longer. The second man smirked at her, then said something to Ortega in Spanish. She heard the word for too much trouble, and her blood went cold. Ortega responded with a warning glare. It sounded like he was telling the partner not to hurt her unless absolutely necessary. She wanted to believe Ortega might have a sliver of conscience, but she couldn't bank on that saving her. She tried to slow her breathing, counting heartbeats, focusing on the faint hope that if the police were searching methodically, they might find tracks leading here. The place felt remote, but remote didn't mean impossible to discover. She clutched that thought like a lifeline. Meanwhile, Ortega's phone buzzed again. He stepped away to answer. His voice lowered, intense. She caught a few words. Money, meeting, tomorrow night. Her stomach churned. Tomorrow night could be the time someone else arrived, someone who might not hesitate to dispose of her. Every minute felt crucial. She scanned her surroundings again, noticing a small window behind the stacked canisters. The boards were hammered across it, but maybe not with the greatest care. If left unsupervised, could she pry one loose? The men seemed exhausted. They moved around the shack like they'd been driving nonstop for too long. The second man, she still didn't know his name, leaned against the wall, arms folded, occasionally throwing her a wary glance. Ortega rummaged in a bag, pulled out a bottle of water, and approached her. He tore off the duct tape and she gasped at the sting on her skin. He pressed the bottle to her lips and she drank. She dared to speak in a soft voice. "Please, if this is about money, let my parents pay. They'll pay any amount." Ortega's expression darkened. "Money is part of it, but it's not that simple." He sealed the bottle and looked at her. "Don't talk." Before she could respond, he shoved a rag into her mouth and wrapped a piece of tape across it again, cutting off any chance to plead further. Anger flared in her chest, but she kept it in check. This was not the moment to antagonize him. She needed him to feel uncertain, maybe even guilty, but not threatened enough to snap. He went back to his phone, packing in the cramped space. The second man took a seat on an upturned crate, pulling out a cigarette. He looked her up and down, then shook his head with mild disgust, as if frustrated to be dealing with a frightened kid. She couldn't read anything deeper in his face. The minutes passed slowly, every second an agony. At one point, the men stepped outside together, leaving her alone. She glanced around, heart hammering. She tried to wriggle her wrists in the rope, but the knots were secure. Frantically, her eyes landed on a rusted tool set lying on a nearby crate. If she could reach it, maybe she could cut herself free. But the table was too far away, and her ankles, though no longer tied, were stiff and sore. She tried standing, testing the range of motion in her arms, but the rope binding her to the chair was wrapped around the seat's frame. She sat back down, cursing the hopelessness of it. Outside, the men talked in muted voices. She caught only fragments through the thin walls, references to meeting at a port, mention of a buyer. The word buyer made her stomach lurch. This was trafficking. They intended to sell her. The idea ignited a flash of panic so intense she had to close her eyes and force herself to breathe. She would not allow herself to be broken. She promised herself she would keep searching for a way out until her last breath. Many miles away, the police continued their manhunt. Helicopters scanned rural roads with searchlights, but the darkness made it nearly impossible to see anything smaller than a moving vehicle on open terrain. Detective crews coordinated with local units, focusing on any property Ortega might have connections to. A few addresses turned out to be dead ends, empty lots, abandoned buildings, or places with no sign of recent activity. Time was slipping away. Each phone call with no new information made Priya despair. She pressed the detective again, asking if there was anything else she or Vikram could do. Crews told her to be patient, that a panicked public statement might tip the kidnappers off and push them further underground. The tension was suffocating. Jake haunted the edges of every search, offering to ride along. The police repeatedly told him no, not wanting a civilian, especially one considered a witness, risking his life in a confrontation. The frustration boiled in him. One officer finally suggested that if Jake wanted to help, he could talk to guests who might have seen Ortega lurking in off-limits areas. Maybe there was a memory or detail no one realized was important. Desperate to contribute, Jake set about systematically interviewing other tourists. He learned that Ortega had been spotted at the gift shop more than once, and that a few staff members thought he'd been spending extra time with the visiting yacht owners at the marina. Nothing concrete, but every scrap of information helped piece together a picture of Ortega's methods. Jake held onto a faint hope that some small clue would crack this wide open. Meanwhile, local children who lived near the cove where Ortega's boat was found mentioned hearing an engine late at night. They were half asleep and had not realized it might be significant. One child recalled seeing headlights bouncing down an unpaved track leading away from the beach. Now that the police had that detail, they dispatched a team to search the connecting roads, but the region had countless forks and intersections. A single vehicle could vanish easily. Somewhere around midnight in the rickety shack, Ananya forced herself to stay awake. She heard the men's voices escalate, arguing over some point of disagreement. One of them mentioned an overdue call. Anxiety trickled through her. What if they were losing patience? The second man sounded agitated, as though he wanted to be done with her. Ortega insisted they had to wait for confirmation, presumably from whoever was supposed to meet them. She caught references to money again, tens of thousands, maybe more. She felt nausea coil in her gut. Was her life reduced to a transaction? When the men stomped back inside, Ortega gave her a look as if to remind her not to try anything. The second man lit another cigarette, the acrid smell filling the space. The hours bled into one another, the only change being the shift in the quality of darkness through the cracks in the boards. At one point, Ananya thought she could see a faint glow that might be the first hint of dawn. She had completely lost track of how long she'd been gone. 2 days. Longer. Her parents on the other side of the island took turns staring at their phones, willing them to ring with good news. It never came. Priya eventually drifted into a restless doze, her head on Vikram's shoulder, only to jerk awake from nightmares that snared her in a loop of fear. Vikram led her to a seat in the corner of the office, urging her to at least rest. She refused at first, but her body betrayed her, exhaustion fogging her vision. She closed her eyes for a moment, tears sliding down her cheeks as she pictured Ananya's bright smile, the excitement on her face when they arrived at the resort. That memory felt like a distant dream. Jake, too, found himself sleepless. He sat on the edge of the beach, waves lapping at his feet. In the distance, the moonlight sparkled off the water. He wondered where Ananya was at that moment, if she could see the sky, if she was hurt. The what-ifs tormented him. He whispered a promise to the emptiness, that he would find her somehow if it was the last thing he did. He wouldn't rest until she was safe. Morning came as a dull gray glow over the horizon, the sun blocked by an overcast sky. Rain threatened, thick clouds rolling in. In the shack, Ortega stepped outside to make a call, leaving the second man to watch over Ananya. She mustered her courage and tried to speak through the tape, a muffled sound that made no sense. The man scowled, telling her to shut up. She let her gaze sweep the room, scanning for anything that might help. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She realized she hadn't eaten more than a few crackers in nearly 2 days. Outside, Ortega's muffled voice rose in agitation. She heard him say something about changing the plan, needing more time. Then the door burst open and he re-entered, looking more tense than ever. He asked his partner if they had enough fuel to drive farther inland. The partner shrugged, stepping outside to check the truck. Ortega's attention flicked to Ananya. She tensed, unsure if he was about to lash out at her. Instead, he marched over and pulled the tape from her mouth, letting the rag drop. She gasped in a breath of stale air. He grabbed a bag and took out another bottle of water and a bag of chips. He handed them to her with an irritated sigh, as though annoyed he had to keep her alive. Grateful for even this small mercy, she drank and chewed gingerly, ignoring the stale taste of the chips. She decided to speak in a calm tone, hoping to pierce through whatever was driving him. "You don't want to do this. I can see it on your face." He pressed his lips together. "You know nothing about me," she swallowed, thinking quickly. "You're not a monster. I've seen how you hesitate if someone's forcing you." His eyes flashed with anger. "No one is forcing me." But the denial rang hollow. She sensed he was under some obligation, maybe indebted to a powerful figure. For a moment he looked like he might say more, but he snapped his mouth shut. With a frustrated huff, he jammed the gag back into her mouth and replaced the tape, signaling the end of the conversation. The morning dragged on. Rain began pattering on the shack's metal roof, intensifying to a pounding downpour. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Ortega and his partner argued about the drive, whether they should risk slippery roads. Ananya listened as best she could, trying to guess where they were going. Then she heard a roar outside, an engine approaching. Her captors tensed, exchanging panicked glances. A new vehicle? Could it be the police? The second man peered out a gap in the boards, muttered a curse, and reached for a weapon. Ortega snatched up a revolver from the table, spinning the cylinder to check its bullets. Fear jolted through Ananya. She braced herself. The engine cut off outside, followed by multiple doors slamming. Heavy footsteps splashed in the mud. Voices called out in Spanish, too faint for her to grasp. Ortega gestured for his partner to open the door, then kept the gun trained on Ananya as if warning her not to move. When the door swung wide, the air carried a gust of rain inside along with two men, both soaked. One was older, grizzled, wearing a baseball cap low over his eyes. The other looked younger, with sharp features and an air of casual menace. They surveyed the shack, glancing at Ananya with mild interest. Immediately, the older man turned to Ortega, demanding why the conditions were so poor. He spoke Spanish so quickly Ananya could barely parse it. She understood only that he was complaining that Ortega had chosen a dangerous location. Ortega shot back that the roads were patrolled, that they had to take what they could get. Tension crackled in the air. Ananya realized these new arrivals were likely the next link in the chain. Buyers, brokers, or something equally horrifying. Her mind reeled. If they took her now, it might be the last time she ever saw anything resembling civilization. Panic clawed at her insides, but she kept her breathing steady, remembering that the slightest chance to escape might still appear. She watched the men argue about the price, about timelines. The younger newcomer smirked, stepping closer to her, looking her over. She turned her face away, shuddering in disgust. He said something to Ortega about verifying she was in good condition, then abruptly grabbed her chin, turning her face toward him. She tried to jerk back, but the ropes and his grip held her in place. He seemed to be checking for bruises or injuries, maybe because their buyer wanted an undamaged product. The revulsion she felt at being treated like an object twisted her stomach. She wanted to fight back, but she knew she'd be overpowered in seconds. He let go, apparently satisfied, and spat something in Spanish at Ortega, who nodded, looking grim. Then, as the men conferred, thunder boomed overhead, so loud it rattled the shack. Rain fell in sheets, making the muddy ground even more treacherous. The group huddled around a cell phone, scanning a map or directions, she guessed. They seemed intent on leaving soon. Ortega signaled to his partner to gather their gear. Panic pulsed in Ananya's veins. If they put her in another vehicle, the chances of the police finding her would shrink even more. She had to do something. She willed herself to remain observant. Maybe one of them would slip up. In the resort's lobby, dawn brought no respite. Priya and Vikram waited for Detective Cruz, who arrived with red-rimmed eyes, holding a dossier of updates. He said there were rumors about a small house inland that might be connected to Ortega's past. Another lead about a potential accomplice's name had surfaced, pulled from phone records. None of it was definitive, but it was something. They wasted no time dispatching officers to follow up. Priya clung to the hope that any minute now, a call might come in saying Ananya was found. Instead, they got a message that a suspicious truck was seen traveling off a side road, heading into a rural area. A partial plate number matched one associated with a known associate of Ortega's. This was the first real lead in hours. Cruz quickly rallied a search team. They set out in 4 vehicles, driving hard through the rain. Vikram tried to join, but Cruz insisted he stay behind for his own safety. The roads became increasingly flooded, muddy water gushing over the asphalt. Windshield wipers struggled to keep up, thunder crackling. The search party pressed on, following the last known direction of that truck. Every so often they had to slow for fallen branches or debris from the storm. Their radios crackled with updates from dispatch, most of them inconclusive. Still, they pushed deeper inland, the tropical rain pounding like war drums around them. In the shack, Ortega and the older newcomer argued in hushed tones. Lightning flashed through the cracks, illuminating the men's scowling faces. The older man was insisting they leave immediately, but Ortega pointed out the storm and how dangerous it would be to navigate the roads. A tense moment passed. The older man pulled out a wad of cash, waving it in Ortega's face as though money trumped all concerns. Ortega swallowed visibly, then nodded. He turned to grab Ananya's shoulder, forcing her upright from the chair. His partner brought a coil of rope and quickly bound her ankles again, ignoring her muffled protest. The younger newcomer smirked in amusement, stepping aside as they prepared to haul her out into the storm. She felt a surge of desperation. If she was ever going to attempt escape, maybe this was it. The men would be distracted by the downpour, the slippery terrain. But she was so tightly bound, she doubted she could take more than a few quick steps before they caught her. Her only chance was if something else intervened: police, a local, something to give her a head start. Otherwise, she'd never outrun them in the mud with her ankles tied. They dragged her outside, rain lashing her face instantly, drenching her hair and clothes. Mud clung to her shoes. She stumbled, nearly falling, but someone yanked her arm up. She caught a glimpse of 2 vehicles, the truck that brought her and a battered SUV the newcomers had arrived in. The plan, it seemed, was to transfer her to the SUV. Its door stood open, the interior light casting a dim glow through the sheets of rain. Ortega's partner took the lead, hauling her toward the SUV's back seat. She tried to angle her feet so that if he loosened his grip, she might twist away. But he was too strong, and her balance was compromised by the rope around her ankles. Lightning forked across the sky, bathing the scene in a stark flash. She noticed for the first time a small wooden barn or shed behind the shack, its roof half collapsed. If she somehow broke free, that might be a place to hide. But the men were right there. Her thoughts raced, searching for a miracle that didn't come. They shoved her into the back seat of the SUV. Rain pounded on the roof. The younger newcomer slid in beside her, snapping a seatbelt across her body more to restrain her than for safety. Ortega's partner climbed in on her other side, effectively trapping her. The older man started the engine, revving it against the downpour. The wipers squeaked across the windshield, barely helping visibility. Ortega slammed the back hatch shut, then climbed into the passenger seat. They eased forward, the tires spinning in the slick mud before finally catching traction. The vehicle lurched onto the dirt road, each pothole jarring Ananya's bound body. As they drove away, thunder rolled across the countryside. Her heart sank. She was in deeper captivity now, with more captors, less chance of rescue. Yet a spark of hope flickered. The more people involved, the larger the operation, the higher the chance someone might slip up or get caught. She prayed that was true because her options were dwindling fast. She wished she could tell her parents she was still alive, that she hadn't given up. She wished she could speak to Jake to say she understood his concern, that she was sorry for leaving him behind on the beach. So many wishes collided in her mind. Rain hammered the SUV relentlessly, creating a deafening backdrop. The men shouted instructions to each other, trying not to skid off the road. Every so often, the older man cursed as they encountered fallen branches or flooded depressions. Ananya peered out the window through streaks of water, seeing only dense vegetation and occasional fields, no signs of civilization. She wondered how long they would drive. She wondered if dawn would bring a break in the storm or if it would rage all day. At that moment, Detective Cruz and his convoy were navigating another route, just a few miles away, scouring the roads for any sign of the suspect truck. Radios crackled with storm alerts, warnings that some roads were blocked by mudslides. They pressed forward, headlights cutting through the murk. One officer pointed out fresh tire tracks that might have belonged to a larger vehicle. They followed them, hearts pounding with adrenaline, but the storm quickly erased any tracks in the soft ground. It was guesswork and instinct now. In the SUV, Ortega took a phone call, leaning toward the window to muffle his voice. The older driver kept glancing at him, irritated by the secrecy. The younger newcomer rummaged in the glove compartment, eventually pulling out a battered road map. They argued about which route to take. She heard them mention a port town on the far side of the island. It seemed likely they were headed there to rendezvous with a boat or another contact. She tried to catch the name of the port, but the men spoke too quickly. They reached a crossroads marked by a single weather-beaten sign. The older man slowed, shining a flashlight on it through the open window to read the faded letters. He swore loudly. It looked like the sign indicated a washed-out road ahead. Ortega told him to try it anyway, that turning back was too dangerous. Reluctantly, the driver pressed on. The SUV rumbled over deep puddles, water splashing up to the windows. The men grew more agitated with each passing minute. One in the back seat rubbed his sweaty palms on his jeans. The tension was suffocating. Suddenly, headlights appeared through the sheets of rain, coming down the narrow road from the opposite direction. The older man cursed, quickly switching off the SUV's headlights, hopping to remain unseen. The oncoming vehicle did the same. For a few moments, both vehicles inched toward each other in near-complete darkness, the only illumination coming from sporadic lightning. Ananya's heart thundered in her chest. Was this another group of criminals, or possibly the police? The men in the SUV drew their guns, adrenaline spiking. Ortega signaled them to remain calm. The two vehicles came to a halt, nose to nose, engines idling. Nobody moved. Rain poured in sheets. Then the other vehicle's headlights flicked on just long enough to illuminate the SUV. The older man spat a curse. He shouted for everyone to hold on and jerked the steering wheel to the right, attempting to maneuver around. The tires spun, losing traction in the mud. The other vehicle roared forward, trying to block them. Ananya ducked her head, bracing for impact, unsure if this was some rival gang or the authorities. A horn blared. The SUV's engine revved again, mud flew, and the vehicle suddenly lurched free, careening down a narrow track off to the side. It bounced violently, flinging Ananya and the men in the back seat against the windows. The second vehicle gave chase, headlights flickering through the downpour. The older driver fought the wheel, trying to maintain control as they skidded across a flooded stretch of dirt. Trees loomed on either side. The chase was a terrifying blur of near collisions and frantic steering. Ananya saw the second vehicle's headlights gain on them, then fall back when the SUV hit a stretch of slightly firmer ground. The men shouted instructions, some in Spanish, some in English, cursing the weather, the road, everything. Ortega demanded the driver lose them, but the older man was having trouble just keeping the SUV on the track. Suddenly, the second vehicle pulled dangerously close. A side mirror was smashed as the pursuer clipped them. Sparks flew. The older man wrestled the wheel, swerving. Water splashed in through the windows. Ananya held her breath. The younger newcomer clutched his gun but couldn't get off a shot in the chaos. Then a flash of lightning revealed a fallen tree across the track. The driver slammed the brakes, but the SUV hydroplaned, wheels sliding. There was a gut-wrenching crunch as they collided with the trunk of the fallen tree. Metal screeched. The SUV lurched to a stop, its hood crumpled. The second vehicle screeched to a halt a short distance behind them. Doors flew open. The men in the SUV were disoriented. Ortega barked at them to grab Ananya. She was jerked violently, pain searing through her shoulder as one of the men tried to drag her out the far door. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the close air, muzzle flashes lighting up the storm. She screamed against her gag, terror flooding every nerve. The older man fired back into the darkness, cursing. Another volley of shots came from outside. She couldn't see who was shooting, whether it was criminals or the police. The second man yanked her out of the SUV, pulling her through the mud. She felt rain lash her face. Her ankles were still tied, so she stumbled, nearly falling onto her knees. Lightning flared again, illuminating silhouettes exchanging gunfire. The older man doubled over with a shout, dropping his weapon into the mud. Ortega cursed, returning fire blindly, but it was obvious they were outnumbered. The younger newcomer pulled her forward, shoving her behind a tree for cover. She saw Ortega crouched low, eyes wide with panic as he realized their attempt to flee was failing. She heard someone shout in Spanish for them to stand down. Could it be the police? Her heart soared at the possibility. The newcomer holding her was breathing hard, weighing his chances. Then he grabbed a small knife, pressed it to her side, and yelled out into the storm that if they fired again, he'd kill her. She tried to wriggle away, but he tightened his grip. Mud soaked her clothes, and the knife's tip dug into her shirt. Everything was chaos, shouting, thunder, the roar of rain, flickering headlights. A moment later, more voices called out, telling him to drop the weapon and let her go. She recognized a phrase in English. "Don't hurt the girl." Her captor bared his teeth, refusing to budge. He dragged her backward, searching for a path through the darkness. Ortega was pinned down by gunfire near the SUV, the second man possibly wounded. Another shot rang out, and the newcomer flinched. The pressure on her side lessened for an instant. She saw him look away, scanning the darkness for threats. In that split second, she remembered the promise she had made to herself to seize any opportunity. She drove her elbow back as hard as she could, catching him in the ribs. He swore, the knife jerking free from her shirt. She twisted away, ignoring the rope around her ankles, forcing herself to hop backward. He grabbed at her arm again, but she managed to slip from his grasp, tumbling into the mud. A loud voice thundered above the din, ordering everyone to freeze. She peered up, blinking rain out of her eyes. A police officer in a drenched uniform appeared, weapon raised. He yelled for her to stay down, then advanced on the newcomer, who scrambled to reach for his gun. The officer fired a warning shot. The newcomer hesitated, then tossed his gun aside, raising his hands. Adrenaline surged in Ananya's chest. She realized with a mixture of relief and disbelief that the men chasing the SUV really were the police. Through the swirling rain, she saw Ortega trying to bolt into the trees, but a second officer tackled him, forcibly disarming him. The older driver was already lying in the mud, blood staining his pant leg, an officer's knee pressed to his back. In a rush of motion, more officers emerged, guns at the ready. One knelt beside her, speaking Spanish, then switching to broken English, asking if she was hurt. She couldn't form coherent words, tears mingling with the rain on her face. She shook her head, overwhelmed. He gently cut the rope at her ankles and wrists. She felt the burning relief of blood flowing freely again. A moment later, Detective Cruz himself arrived, battered by the storm, hair plastered to his forehead. He leaned down, recognized her from photos, and called out that they had found the girl. Radio static crackled with the news. She could hardly believe it was real. She sagged in the mud, sobbing with relief, letting the officers help her upright. The men who had taken her were disarmed, cuffed, shoved face first into the mud amid shouts of "Manos atrás" and "Quieto." Ambulances were summoned for the injured suspect and for Ananya in case she needed medical attention. The detective gently told her that her parents had been searching everywhere, that she was safe now. She nodded, tears streaming, too stunned to speak. Someone draped a blanket over her soaked shoulders. She was led toward the line of police vehicles. Blue and red lights cut through the rain, revealing a team of officers who had risked the storm to chase them down. As she sat in the back of an officer's jeep, Detective Cruz radioed the resort. Within minutes, Priya and Vikram received the call they had been praying for. Their daughter was alive. The news sent them collapsing into each other's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, relief flooding through them with almost painful intensity. Jake was there too, tears of gratitude welling in his eyes. He felt a wave of guilt lifting from his shoulders. Ananya was safe. He had no idea what she might have endured, but she was alive. Shortly afterward, an ambulance navigated the flooded road, its lights reflecting off pools of standing water. The paramedics checked Ananya's vitals, gently cleaning the mud from her arms. She huddled under the blanket, shaky and numb. The detective asked if she felt strong enough to answer a few questions. She nodded, giving a halting account of her ordeal. Her words tumbled out in a rush, describing Ortega, the second man, the shack, the arrival of the new buyers. Cruz listened intently, expression grim. She could see anger and relief mixing in his eyes. He reassured her that the men were all in custody, that they would face justice. She let out a trembling sigh, too exhausted to think beyond the moment. Officers swarmed the crash site, securing evidence, photographing weapons, rummaging through the SUV. They found the cash, a small stash of drugs and multiple phones. Ortega and his accomplices were taken away in separate vehicles, some cursing, some silently fuming. The older driver clutched his wounded leg. No one was in the mood to offer him sympathy. The storm raged on, lightning illuminating the twisted metal of the crashed SUV. Ananya closed her eyes for a moment, leaning back in the ambulance, hearing the steady patter of rain on the roof. She allowed herself to feel the faint flicker of safety for the first time since she'd stepped out of her hotel room on that fateful night. A paramedic offered her a warm drink from a thermos, which she sipped with shaking hands. She thought of her parents, pictured their tearful relief when they finally saw her. She thought of Jake, how worried he must have been. She felt an ache in her chest as she recalled the haunting hours in that shack, the constant terror. But she was free now. Somehow, in the midst of a violent storm and a desperate chase, the authorities had found her before it was too late. The officers led her to one of the trucks that would take her back to the main road, away from the mud and tangled wreckage. She limped slightly, her ankle bruised from the ropes. The detective helped her climb in, promising that medical care awaited her at the resort's clinic. She nodded, her emotions a tangled storm of relief, trauma, and gratitude. The drive back was slow, the road half flooded, but every mile reassured her that she was returning to a place of safety. The adrenaline slowly ebbed, leaving exhaustion in its wake. As dawn broke on the horizon, the clouds began to thin, and the rain lightened to a drizzle. Word of her rescue reached the resort. Staff who had spent the entire night awake embraced each other, tears on their cheeks. Priya and Vikram stood by the front entrance, waiting. When the police truck rolled in, Priya ran forward, arms outstretched, barely able to contain her sobs. Ananya stumbled into her mother's embrace, tears slipping free as she felt her parents' warmth. Vikram pressed kisses to her mud-caked hair, whispering, my girl, you're safe." She clung to them both, her body trembling with relief. Jake stood a few paces behind, not wanting to intrude on the family reunion. But when Ananya's eyes found him, she let go of her parents and walked toward him. Tears glistened on his cheeks. Without words, he wrapped his arms around her in a gentle hug, careful not to hurt her bruises. She buried her face in his shoulder for a moment, letting the reality of her survival sink in. Finally, she looked up at him, managing a tiny, grateful smile. The police escorted her inside, medics hurrying forward to guide her to an exam room. Despite Priya's protests that they should let Ananya rest, the officers needed a more complete statement, at least enough to ensure they had all the suspects identified. The nurse promised that Ananya could rest soon, that they just needed to check her for injuries. Ananya followed in a daze, her parents trailing close behind, refusing to let her out of sight. She realized how desperately they had feared never seeing her again. She squeezed their hands in reassurance, wishing she could wipe away their pain. Behind them, the sun broke through the last vestiges of storm clouds, illuminating the resort in a gentle glow. Staff members milled about, whispering relief, passing the news that the missing girl had been found alive. A few even began to cheer softly, heartened that there was a good outcome to a nightmare scenario. For a moment, the Caribbean paradise felt like paradise again, though it bore the scars of fear and tension that wouldn't soon fade. Ananya allowed the medics to examine her. She had bruises on her wrists and ankles, minor cuts, dehydration, and stress-related exhaustion, but she was otherwise unharmed. She was lucky. Her parents couldn't stop tears of gratitude from flowing. She learned that Ortega and his accomplices were in custody, that they faced serious charges for kidnapping, attempted human trafficking, and other crimes. Detective Cruz promised her they would never again pose a threat. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that justice would be done. After the examination, she emerged into the hallway, where Vikram and Priya enveloped her in another hug. The relief in their eyes was immeasurable. They asked if she felt strong enough to talk about what happened, but she shook her head. Not yet. She needed time. Jake lingered near the wall, hands shoved in his pockets, anxiety flickering across his face. She managed a faint smile of encouragement, letting him know she was all right. Someone from the resort staff guided them to a private suite, offering it as a quiet space for their family to regroup away from curious onlookers. Priya and Vikram led Ananya inside, helping her into a chair. She sank into the soft cushions, overwhelmed by the normalcy of it. White curtains fluttered in the morning breeze, and a pitcher of water sat on the side table. She took a long sip, closing her eyes, trying to process everything that had happened. Her parents gently asked if she needed anything: food, a doctor, more rest. She shook her head and quietly said she just wanted to feel the sun on her face. Priya nodded, guiding her to the balcony. The air was warm, carrying the scent of wet foliage. They stood together, letting sunlight wash over them. For a moment, no one spoke. The events of the past days hung in the air, too heavy for words. Finally, Priya whispered, "You're here. That's all that matters." Ananya exhaled a shaky breath, tears dripping silently. She wasn't sure she would ever fully recover from the terror she had experienced. Nightmares would likely haunt her for a long time, but at least now she had the chance to heal, the chance to see a future. Her mother's hand closed gently around hers. She squeezed back, grateful to still have a life to live. If you found this story captivating, there's so much more to explore on my YouTube channel. Subscribe now and join a community that delves into gripping tales, real-life mysteries, and insightful discussions. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a new upload.